Again, good morning, church. Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining us online or here at Hershey Free. I'm going to ask you, if you would, in your Bibles to turn with me to John chapter 3. John chapter 3. Now, as you're turning there, I think you're probably aware, most of us are aware, that right now in northern Italy, the Winter Olympics are going on. I'm just curious, how many of you've watched some part of the Olympics? Right? That's most of us. This year, just due to a variety of things, I haven't been able to watch as much as I normally do, but I will confess this, and that is, I'm curious if some of you do this. Just a couple of times throughout the day, I will pull out my phone, I'll pull up the ESPN app, and where do I go? I go to the medal count, right? How are we doing? Are we keeping pace with Norway? I mean, these are the compelling. Come on, at least, guys, let's get past Italy, right? I don't know if we can beat Norway, but can we at least get past Italy? And I find myself getting excited about medals in sports I don't even know the rules for. But there's something of, hey, we medaled in that sport, and this is for most of us, this is the one time we actually even pay attention to most of these sports, right? But for me, there's just something about seeing that clip, and you see the medal ceremony, you see the flags going up, and you hear the Star-Spangled Banner. That's just a great moment. Maybe you kind of go through the games the same way. I don't know if you have the same experience. But understand this. It's one thing to approach the Olympics this way. It's different to approach life this way. It's one thing to spend a few days kind of watching the Olympics and comparing our athletes to other athletes in their performances. It's another thing to live life where you are regularly looking around and comparing yourself to others. What grade did they get on that test? I got a better grade. Why did they get invited to that party and I didn't? How can they afford that kind of house? We can't afford anything like that. Why did he get promoted ahead of me? Why doesn't my family look like that family? This morning we're continuing our study of John's gospel. As we go through this book, we're observing the life Jesus lived, but also the life he offers to each and every one of us. And today, we're going to look at another conversation recorded in this book. And as we look at this conversation, I want you to note, we're going to see something that has the potential to sabotage your life. In fact, as we go through this text, you might find yourself honestly saying internally, that's where I'm stuck right now. But not only are we going to see a potential hazard, we're also going to see the way Jesus offers a different approach to life. Last week we saw a conversation recorded in John chapter 3 between Jesus and the religious leader Nicodemus. Now we're going to pick up the conversation in verse 22 and see another dialogue. So we're beginning in John 3:22. After this, and this is sometime after, right, that conversation we read about last week. After this, Jesus and his disciples went out into the Judean countryside where he spent some time with them, and they were baptized. Now, John also was baptizing at Ainon near Salim because there was plenty of water and people were coming and being baptized. This was before John was put in prison. So as we're going to see this conversation in a moment between John the Baptist and his disciples, the author sets the scene for us. And here's the scene. Jesus and his disciples have moved to the Judean countryside, and they're baptizing some people. Now, John will later clarify it was actually the disciples doing the baptizing, not Jesus. Meanwhile, even as Jesus and his group is ministering in the Judean countryside, kind of part of the central Israel, John the Baptist is continuing to have his ministry with his disciples, and people are continuing to come to him and continuing to be baptized. That's kind of the setting that we see as we're going to enter the conversation recorded. But before we get to that conversation, the author makes this interesting comment. He says, this was before John was put in prison. Now, to be honest with you, this detail just it's not necessary, really. It doesn't really fit into the flow of what we're going to read. In fact, you'll notice the translators put it in parentheses. Now, why does John give us this detail? This was before John the Baptist was put in prison. Because as it turns out, the author won't even come back to the issue of John in prison. He just drops this comment. So why is this included? Well, I think the best answer is this. The author is aware that some of his readers may already be familiar with the story of Jesus. And I think he is aware that some of his readers may already be familiar with the Gospel of Mark. And in Mark's gospel, when Mark really begins focusing on the public ministry of Jesus, he begins after John was arrested. He begins after the arrest of John the Baptist. In fact, we see this right in the opening part of Mark, right? After John, and this is John the Baptist, after John the Baptist was put in prison, Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. So here's what I think is going on. The author doesn't want you reading his book and then reading Mark and going, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This is contradictory. We can't believe this. The author wants you to understand, hey, listen, what I'm telling you, all of this happened before Mark picks up the ministry of Jesus. There's no contradiction. All of this is true. All of this is rooted in history. Now here's the reason I just wanted to highlight that for you. I think for some it's easy to read the Gospels and almost come away and say, Jesus had some interesting teaching, about loving your neighbor, all that's good, but this really isn't historical. These people just made up stories. They weren't concerned about history. They were just about teaching moral lessons. But what I want you to see here is this author is tremendously concerned about you and me understanding that the story of Jesus is rooted in historical fact. That's why he wants to make sure, in case you're familiar with Mark's gospel, that you understand, look, this is taking place before all that stuff that you've read in Mark's gospel. So you need to understand it is grounded in history. Now, let's continue after that sidebar with this scene. So we've got Jesus, his disciples in one area. We've got John the Baptist and his disciples in another area. And then this happens. An argument developed between some of John's disciples and a certain Jew over the matter of ceremonial washing. Now that shouldn't surprise us. As we saw in chapter 1, we saw religious leaders coming to John the Baptist. They were, kind of interrogating him because John was baptizing differently. And there was this, I think, fear, concern that John is starting a revolutionary movement. So his disciples then get into an argument with another person about the whole issue of ceremonial washing. But then his disciples come to John. They come to John the Baptist and said, Rabbi, that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan, the one you testified about, look, he is baptizing and everyone is going to him. Now, how do we get from the disciples arguing with the Jew about ceremonial washing to this question that they then bring to John the Baptist? I'm not quite sure. Maybe Jesus came up in this conversation. Maybe this person they were arguing with said, and by the way, not only are you guys doing it, but this other guy is also doing it. Or maybe maybe they felt this way. Look how hard we've worked. Look how much grief we have endured to be faithful. We're getting all the opposition, and yet this guy is getting people to come to him as well. Whatever the reason, they now come complaining to John the Baptist. And I think in essence what they are saying is something like this. Hey, remember that other guy you talked about earlier? Do you remember that guy? Well, he's now competing with us. He's baptizing too, and notice, and everybody's going to him. That's not true. We just read people are still coming to John the Baptist, but everybody's going to him. So what are you going to do about it? I think that's what they, look at this. Look at what's going on over there. That's not fair. We've worked hard. So John the Baptist, what are you going to do about it? I think if we could summarize what we're reading here in one word, the word would be this: envy. And when we begin to see that here, all of a sudden this very ancient text, situated in a very different context, becomes very personal. Because I think to varying degrees, each of us is susceptible to this. Furthermore, for those of us who are followers of Christ, I think sometimes we end up doing the same thing as John's followers. Right? We look around and say, why is that happening to them and not me? Why did they get that promotion and I didn't? Why are those kids so popular yet I'm the one in school that's really committed to my faith? Why am I going through these hardships? And it seems like other people I know, other Christians I know, are just breezing through life. Do you ever find yourself looking at other people and going, why me? Or maybe, why not me? This was this group of disciples as they came to their leader, John the Baptist. Why is that happening to him and not to us? This week I had just some interesting conversations with members of our staff about this. And it was a great, very transparent conversation because it's people who were involved in church leadership and engaged in leading ministry, we ended up acknowledging, sometimes this is just easy to do in church. I mean, part of the reality is as leaders, we're aware of, we get to see what other leaders are doing. We get to see what churches are featured in conferences and different publications and outlets. And we just talked about that, sometimes we're just looking at other churches. Wow, I wish we could do that. I wish we had that kind of ministry. Wish we had those kinds of resources. I wish, and so we just acknowledge the reality that in church circles, we can find ourselves dealing with this reality of envy. And as we talked, we just acknowledged certain things that come with envy, like discontentment, right? Sometimes we just become discontent with the kind of the opportunities, the abilities God has put in our lives. Over time, that envy can develop into bitterness, resentment. And I think tragically, when we get stuck in envy, we're actually devaluing kind of the roles, the abilities, the opportunities that God is even now placing in our lives. As it turns out, in different ways, Jesus actually addressed this issue in his teaching. For instance, do you remember that parable Jesus told, that story Jesus told that's recorded in Matthew chapter 20? It's the story of the workers in the vineyard. You know, the owner goes out and he hires people early in the morning, he hires people at 9, and then he hires different people throughout the day. And at the end of the day, everyone gets a full day's wage, even if they didn't work the entire day. Of course, you know, the funny part is, I've noticed over time, whenever we read that parable, where do we put ourselves? We always put ourselves in the first group, don't we? That's the group we relate to. And yet, as it turns out, no one was cheated. They all got the reality of a full day's wage. And as Jesus concludes the story, the landowner raises this question. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Are you envious because I'm generous? And I think among other things, Jesus is just acknowledging with this very simple story that sometimes we become envious of the work of God's grace in the lives of other people. And here's what we have to come to grips with. For Jesus, envy flows out of mistrust. Mistrust of God's goodness, his timing, his love. Again, in Mark 7, Jesus says that envy is one of those things that will defile you. It will corrode you. It will destroy you from the inside out. And it can be hard to kind of tackle this because at times we feel very justified in our envy. Look how hard I've worked. Look how hard I've labored. Look at how responsible I've been. And yet there are things going on in their lives that aren't going on in mine. In fact, over time, you may find yourself kind of walking into this place week after week, and you just look at some people, and there's just a low-level presence of resentment or bitterness because there are things going on in their life that aren't going on in yours, or there are things you're having to deal with and they don't have to deal with. And we feel very justified with our sense of fairness because this is where we're stuck, or we seem to be stuck. But I think we've got to wrestle with how Jesus deals with this, that ultimately it's flowing out of mistrust. Mistrust of God's character, mistrust of God's activity. Therefore, so how do we avoid this? Well, let's continue with this conversation and let's notice the response of John the Baptist, right? So the disciples of John the Baptist come to him. They're frustrated. Look at this other guy. We've worked so hard. Look at how much we've sacrificed. And look at those things over there. It's not fair. John the Baptist, what are you going to do about it? And John says this. To this, right? All the complaining and the whining. To this, John replied, a person can receive only what is given them from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I'm not the Messiah, but am sent ahead of him. The bride belongs to the bridegroom. The friend who attends the bridegroom waits and listens for him and is full of joy when he hears the bridegroom's voice. That joy is mine and it is now complete. He must become greater. I must become less. Now, as you read that response, pay attention to this. John and his disciples are going through the same experience. Furthermore, John and his disciples, in essence, have the same information. Right? I mean, John says, didn't I tell you? Don't you remember? I told you I'm not the Messiah. He's the Messiah. I'm just the one coming ahead of him. I told you that. Don't you remember? So they're going through the exact same situation, going through the exact same experience with, I think, basically the same information, yet they're responding totally differently. His disciples are responding out of a sense, I think, of anger and frustration and disappointment. But John is embracing this moment with a deep sense of joy, right? I think it's a deep sense of commitment, resting in who God is and what he is doing. So if I were to simply summarize the difference between these two responses, I think I would put it this way. The disciples are approaching life with a sense of competition. John is approaching life with a sense of calling. And we can do that well. We can approach life with a sense of competition and kind of live in a way where I'm always looking around. How am I doing comparing to those people? How do I match up with their family, with their job, with their income? And we can approach life that. Or like John the Baptist, we can approach life with a sense of calling. That there's actually a deep purpose at work in my life. Notice the illustration John uses, right? It's an ancient wedding celebration. And understand, in this ancient context, the friend of the groom is kind of a combination best man and wedding coordinator. That's the role. And John says, you know what? That's the role I've been given. And he says, I have experienced deep contentment and deep joy in embracing that. Now, I realize immediately, I bring up this concept of calling, and I think for us, I think in church circles, whenever we talk about calling, I don't know about you, it often feels like a really frustrating and demoralizing thing to talk about. I mean, after all, I can look in the Bible. I see the calling of Paul, right? And this vision and changes everything. Or I can see clearly the calling of God on John the Baptist's life, right? He's the forerunner. He has a unique role. And we look around and we say, you know what? I've never had this dramatic vision. I don't sense this deep purpose in my life. The lives of these people in the Bible, they're so different than mine. So I realize when we talk about calling and kind of what is that deep purpose at work in your life, I realize that can be frustrating, and I don't want to minimize that because I think for some of us we say, look, John the Baptist, he has a unique role. I don't really think I have a unique role. I'm just trying to get through life. I'm just trying to get the kids on the bus tomorrow, right? There's no deep call, right? And I get that. But if that's how you respond to this topic, let me highlight two things for you. First, please realize John doesn't always understand his calling either. You see, here's the problem. We read the Bible, we read the story of John the Baptist, and I can look at it in a matter of minutes. I can look at the whole story from start to finish. I know exactly what's going to happen. I know exactly where it starts and where it ends. But that's not how you live life. That's not how John the Baptist lived life. Yes, there's this very unique role that he plays, but he didn't always get it. I mean, remember what we saw in chapter 1? The religious interrogators come to him and they say, hey, are you Elijah? And that's a reference to Old Testament prophecies about a coming prophet who will have a unique role. And he says, no, I'm not Elijah. And then we go to Matthew's gospel and we read this story where Jesus says, oh, by the way, he is Elijah. And I think it's not a contradiction. It's just John, at the moment, didn't fully understand what God was doing in him and through him. We see the whole story as readers of these narratives, but that's not how these people lived. They lived day to day, just like you and me, and that there were days where John just didn't get it. There were days when this deep calling on his life didn't seem that deep. But even in the midst of it, there was a commitment to obedience. And I think over time it produced this deep contentment in his life that he was embracing God's calling. So the first thing I would say, if this whole thing of calling just feels really nebulous or unhelpful to you, is just remember the people in the Bible, they wrestled with it too. You're not alone in that. And the second thing, very quickly, would just be this. Start with what we know. Sometimes we wrestle with, I got to figure out God's will, and that means what, we think in terms of marriage, relationships, jobs, focus, and all kinds of different things, and it feels so nebulous and so unknown. But in the midst of that chaos, when we talk about God's calling, start with what you know. If you were a follower of Jesus, I think there are certain dimensions of your calling that we already know. Think about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Think about the way in which here at Hershey Free, we talk of this journey of following Jesus, right? We talk about it in terms of living with Jesus, loving like Jesus, and leading others to do the same. Now, again, that's not intended to be some great tagline for a commercial, but it's intended to communicate a way of life. And if you are a follower of Jesus, I can say foundational to the calling of God on your life are these elements. You've been called into relationship with Jesus. In fact, later in John's gospel, Jesus will talk about abiding in him. You've been called into community. You've been called into relationships with other believers and to reflect the character of Christ in all of your relationships. And later in John's gospel, Jesus will pray for our unity. And you've been called into mission. And that includes different ways in which God works in us to work through us into the lives of other people. And later in this gospel, Jesus will pray because he knows he is sending us out even as he has been sent. So, John approaches his life with a sense of calling. As the section ends, we have this very famous statement, right, where John says, he must become greater, I must become less. And I think in understanding that statement, it's important to understand the context. And so that brings us to the final paragraph in this chapter, which, as we saw last week, there was a conversation and then a reflection by the author. I think this is something similar. We've seen the conversation and now a reflection by the author. And this reflection helps us understand the context of what John has just said. Let me explain that to you. Let's read it. The one who comes from above is above all. The one who is from the earth belongs to the earth and speaks as one from the earth. The one who comes from heaven is above all. He testifies to what he has seen and heard, but no one accepts his testimony. Whoever has accepted it has certified that God is truthful. For the one whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for God gives the Spirit without limit. The Father loves the Son and has placed everything in his hands. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, but whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on them. So what does this section mean? Well, remember, I think in this book, the final words we hear from John the Baptist as he's been dealing with his disciples is, right? He must become greater, I must become less. But then I think the author gives us the context in which we should understand this. And notice what he says. The one who comes from above is above all. Who is that? That's Jesus. Right? He's the one who comes from above all. He's the one who comes from heaven. The one who is from earth belongs to the earth. That's John the Baptist. And this isn't a criticism of John, it's just an acknowledgement of his limitations. He's human. And what the author is getting at is this. Jesus is now about to fully take center stage. We're now about to see the ministry, the public ministry of Jesus in its fullness. And as Jesus takes center stage, we no longer need the work of the forerunner. His job has been completed. And that's what John the Baptist has just announced to his disciples, right? When the sun rises, you no longer need the light of the moon. And as we get to the end of John chapter 3, the sun is rising. And for the rest of this book, John will give the story of the public ministry of Jesus. Now, as that happens, there's one other thing I want you to notice. As the author reflects on all that is happening, as he reflects on the fact that, yes, there's been this sense of envy, but John is full of joy because he's completed his mission. And as he reflects on the fact that Jesus is now taking center stage, and now we will see Jesus' ministry in its fullness. Notice one thing that the author says about those who put their faith and trust in him. Whoever has accepted it has certified that God is truthful. It's an interesting kind of turn of phrase that the author uses here, and it can also kind of be used in this sense. It can be used in essence to say, whoever has believed in Jesus has set his seal in the work of God. Think about kind of a wealthy person in ancient times who wore a signet ring that bore his or her insignia. And when he or she signed a contract or sealed a document, that you put your signet ring into the wax, signifying that you are now bound to this contract, or you're bound to what is contained in this letter. It's an ancient way of saying you've signed on the dotted line. When you become a follower of Christ, you have set your seal on Jesus. You have set your seal on the promises of God. Now that we've worked through this conversation and the reflection of it, I want to pull it all together this way. I want to pull it together with a challenge. And I want to direct this challenge to those of you who are followers of Jesus. This is something you may need to do today. It's something you may need to do this week. It's something you may find yourself needing to do later in the month. Here's the challenge. The next time you find yourself drifting into envy, right? Drifting into that mindset where you are comparing yourself to others. Maybe drifting into a mindset where you find yourself competing with others. Or maybe drifting into a mindset where you're wondering, why do certain things happen in their lives and they're not happening in mine? The next time you find that happening, my prayer is that God will bring this verse to your mind, that you will remember this verse. I have set my seal on Jesus. I have set my seal on the truthfulness of the promises of God. For example, maybe there are challenges in your job right now. I know for some of us this is the case. I've had, conversations with people recently, and it's like there's been an acquisition of my company, or there's been a reorganization, there have been changes, and maybe your job feels at risk, or it feels like in the midst of some, internal politics, you're being looked over for an opportunity for a promotion. And in that moment, it's just so easy just in that moment to just look around and, look at what's going on in his life, or look at that life. They're just moving so far and so fast in their career, and I just feel stuck. It's just, in that moment, it's easy to look around, and maybe that's where you're at. Maybe it's even hard to come to church because you see, unfortunately, I think what Satan wants you to convince you every time you come into this place, Satan wants to convince you, hey, you're the only one with issues here. Everybody else, their life is just perfect. Trust me, it's not. It's not. We're in this together. But the next time you find yourself just looking around and comparing and competing, feeling like it's not fair, resentful because it feels like you've been faithful and have nothing to show for it, the next time I want you to just remember, I have set my seal in Jesus. So instead of just getting caught up looking back and forth and looking around at other people, instead of doing that, I'm going to look ahead. And I'm going to come back to the reality that as a follower of Jesus, I've been called by God himself. And I realize we wrestle with what are the specifics of that calling. I get all that. But here are some things we do know as a believer. I have been called into relationship with God. And in the midst of whatever you're going through that is tempting you to look left or right, to say, I've set my seal on Jesus, and I'm going to pursue that relationship, even in the midst of this uncertainty. And even in the midst of whatever that looks like, I know I've been called into community. I know I've been called into relationships with others. And so maybe some of this is kind of making sure there are people in my life that can pray for me, that can encourage me, that can at times be a sounding board for wisdom and decisions. Don't let yourself be isolated in the middle of these situations, because the calling on your life is different than that. And finally, I know I've been called into mission. And again, this is going to look differently in each of our lives. It's going to look differently in your life, in different seasons of life. But God, in the midst of this chaos or this frustration, this hard situation, empower me that my life will reflect your character and the good news of the gospel. So the next time this happens, remember, you have set your seal in the work of Jesus Christ. You can engage life with a sense of competition, or you can engage it with a sense of calling. And that decision will make all the difference in the world.